It's gonna be some stream stuff, BLT week 6, week 7, all that good stuff. I'm gonna fix the stream real quick before we start. Let's edit this stuff. 6, 7 plus playoffs. Sure, we'll go ahead and edit week 6, week 7 plus playoffs. Okay. All right, so let's just get started here. We'll start with week 6. I'll try to go through this all like relatively quickly so we can get to the interesting stuff that people probably want to hear more about, which is playoff implications. I have a whole doc written up, also a post on it, and then we'll go through predictions after the playoff implications are on the line, we go through all the playoff implications. So we'll start with here the Swamperts versus Goodras. Swamperts continue their strong streak even without updated Kanto, who I believe last week, I think it was last week at least, received a permanent ban because of multiple things that happened. I don't want to go too much into it here, but basically there was a lot of issues that he had in some private servers, and so now he's permanently banned, which will be a huge hit to the Swamperts overall. But they didn't suffer that much this week, as they did manage to pick up the win 5-3, and that means they secured a top 2 seed here in playoffs. They're already guaranteed either first or second, and most likely first, as long as they keep up their strong performance. They just need a tie to secure it. Friso Ava beat Star Real. Bandrizzle continued his good streak versus Solar Flare RO. Dandaman also continuing his good streak with Gorax not playing too well so far in BLT. And then Toasted Buns picked up a win versus TMM, which was a very solid win. He's been playing very well. And X Skelly also picking up a win in NU. I'm Just Gray picking up a win in LC. TTT beating SMB and Thunderbirds. All like relatively good performances, especially for TTT, who had a really good performance in doubles. And SMB not really showing up as we would like him to, maybe in doubles so far, or having 2 losses already. Not even playing that many games of doubles, to be honest. A lot of his wins have come from more of the singles tiers. And in the other slots, I think is relatively expected results. The Swamperts still continue to have a strong showing. And the Goodras been on a slide after being in like the 3rd spot just a couple weeks ago. Now they're down at 8th. They still have a chance at playoffs. In fact, every team has a chance at playoffs, but they aren't really in control of their own destiny anymore. So it requires them to play like out of their mind. Moving on, Snoms versus Roughlets. The Roughlets picked up a 5-3 win. Actually, they were up 5-1 at some point, with I believe NRTS being the only one who won a game for the Snoms, and that is actually like really important because Arsenine has been having a really bad season so far. He hasn't really won any games, none like that are important at least, and so if the Roughlets do now move into a very good spot for playoffs. But if they want to contest some of the higher up teams, they will probably have to have a better performance from him. In the other slots, Skipcan put up a good performance against GW. And then Oras Mega also took a solid win off Ramo Lost. Excelsior also having a really strong season, being one of the few undefeated players left. and then Shadow Monster having a solid win against Plaz, and Floss having a solid win in Mono as well. All having strong performances, and Roughlets kind of rounding out their season by having a lot of strong performing players. With the exception of Arsenine, I think everyone else on their team is kind of outperforming basically what I had expected from them, or at least performing to expectation or outperforming that expectation. And so it is looking good for them moving towards playoffs. We managed to secure a playoff spot with a tie against the Hadrians, but the Hadrians picking up this tie as opposed to a loss was really important for them to be able to move into a strong spot moving forward. And that meant that they had to beat us in some of our strongest tiers, including doubles and mono, with Z-Strats and Dugza picking up big wins in there. Ewan continues his really strong streak in SSOU, and Peachy Clouds also had a solid win over Attribute. In the middle tiers, Kather had a really solid win against GXE. Fellyburn had his win as well, as Prince of All Tacos also picking up a good win. And I won my game against Skiriko in a very solid fashion as well. The Alakazams finally pulled off their first win against the Bolts, managing to go 5-3. They Ham did lose against Trade, who has been one of the best players so far in the tournament, going 5-0 in multiple different tiers. Twixtree managed to win in OU, and then Tectonic Destroyer won in UU. Mac 3 in RU, and then Ziri picking up a huge win in NU, finally being able to take that game. In LC, Tendies come to Papa 1, aided by a few kind of lucky sequences at the end with the Mienfoo, but you know, you have to get a little bit lucky, I think, to be a player that's better than you. So I think that's like relatively reasonable. And then Lightning managed to pick up a win in doubles, very important for him. And Richard Pepper picking up a win in mono versus Maki's Fox, who has been performing very poorly as well. So with that said, let's move on to the playoff standings, as well as we'll talk a little bit about the players. So here, we'll go through. I have listed here in this Google Doc all of the possible scenarios for playoffs right here. So Swamperts are locked for playoffs. They have already won. They're in a good spot. They are 5-1. I'll pull up the standings just so you get a good idea right next to it of where every team stands. So the Swamperts are 5-1. They are at 10 points. They're pretty much above the rest of the teams. The only team that can catch them is us, the Snorlaxes. And if we win and they lose, then we will get the first seed. But in every other scenario, they're already in a first seed. So if we tie and they tie, or if they tie at all and we win, it doesn't matter. We can't catch them. So they can. The only way they can drop out of the first seed is by losing, and then the Snorlax is winning. Honestly, though, I don't think it's a huge deal. I'm personally not worried about what seed we get, because I think we can beat any team, and I don't really see any of the teams as being that much stronger than the rest. So I don't think there's a huge difference for me between getting seed 1 or getting seed 4. I think like all of the seeds are like very close anyway. So to me, I'm more focused on getting to or like on playoffs in general. And with that said, the Snorlaxes are also locked for playoffs. Like I decided to just rest my players that wanted rest. I'm personally not playing to give some of these other players a chance to play, since if they wanted to. And so now that we have that playoff berth, I'm taking a little bit more liberties for this week, and then we'll be focused on playoffs next week. We can finish in any of these 4 seeds. We could finish in first, as I talked about earlier. We could finish in second, where we are right now. We could finish in third or even fourth if some things don't go well for us technically. Like for example, if the Hadrians win and we lose by a large margin, and the Roughlets win, then we could slide down to fourth. But most likely, we will probably be in the second or third seed. If this week goes like as a normal week, I should say. So those are the only 2 slots that are locked up. All of the other teams could potentially make it into playoffs, or they could even slide down pretty far. With the exception of the Roughlets, every other team can be finishing anywhere from playoffs to 8th place. So the Roughlets could finish potentially as the 5th team in playoffs, or finish as the 5th team, or they could finish as 2nd seed, depending on where they go. So here, these are all outlined. The potential situations here are all outlined. So playoffs, they make it if they win or tie. So they're completely in control of their own fate. They are one of the few teams that are still in control of their own fate. Actually, in fact, all of the 3 teams up here are in control of their own fate. But yeah, they make it to playoffs if they win or tie, straight up. And they also make it if they lose. So okay, these situations are broken down by like the potential situations. So if they win or tie, that's one situation, and they will always make it. So if they lose, there are 2 situations where they can make it. They can lose and the Hadrians lose, or they can lose by a differential of 2 or lower and the Hadrians tie. So if they lose by a situation of, if they lose by, for example, 5, so this one's straightforward. If they lose and the Hadrians lose, they make it in, and the Bolts will make it in. So if they lose by a situation of like 5-3, for example, this is one way that, well, actually, yeah. So if they lose 5-3, for example, then and the Hadrians tie, then they will also make it. And in this case, I believe that, in that situation, actually the Bolts and the Roughlets will make it, because if the Hadrians tie, then they'll only be at +2 differential, and +1 differential, and the Bolts will be at +4 differential, so the Bolts will make it over them. The only situation that they can get into a tiebreaker with is they go into the tiebreaker against the Bolts if they lose by a differential of 1. This is extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely, because this would involve a dead game. Basically, it would have to be a win of 4-3, and since that's very unlikely to happen, like most likely you'll just play that last game because it is an important game. Like this is a very unlikely situation to happen. So it does say that there's a tiebreaker here, but very likely it will not happen. And that also involves the Hadrians winning. But the other situation would be also this would be a tiebreaker against the Bolts. The other situation is a tiebreaker against the Hadrians if they lose by a differential of 3 and the Hadrians tie. So what that means is they need to alright, so tiebreaker against Hadrians if they lose by a differential of 3 and the Hadrians tie, so they need to lose like 5-2, for example. Yeah, 5-2 would be a way, and basically the last one dead gamed, and that's how they would achieve this result. It's also relatively unlikely because all of these like odd number differentials situations can only happen if there's a dead game. And since dead games are relatively unlikely in the last week, you probably don't have to acknowledge some of these tiebreak situations, but I just listed them in case they do happen. Also, seeds 2 through 5 are possible. For every other team, you can finish 2 through 8th. So if the season goes horribly wrong in this last week for the Hadrians, they could finish in 8th, but it's relatively unlikely. It would require a lot of teams to step up that currently have not shown the ability to step up in big situations. So we'll see. The Hadrians make it to playoffs if they win. This is completely in their own control. They're playing the Goodras this week, and actually a lot of the playoff situations for these lower teams actually hinge on the Goodras and the Hadrians, or the Goodras beating the Hadrians, as well as the Roughlets beating the Bolts, but the Roughlets have a lot more incentive to keep trying because they are, in fact, still in a position to, keep contesting for a playoff seed and that kind of stuff. So the Roughlets are more incentivized, but like the Goodras, I don't know if the Goodra people are actually that interested in continuing to perform well and trying to pick up a playoff spot, because I mean, I've heard from PA, Poison Adhesive, their manager, that they just wanted to like play for fun this last week, even though they still have a shot at playoffs. I think it's kind of ridiculous, but you know, some people have that kind of attitude, so you know, whatever. But it would ruin the chance of all of these other lower teams, the Snoms, Alakazams, Goodras. They all are basically fucked a lot harder. And even the Bolts are in a lot worse of a spot if the Goodras basically just give up. They did pick up a win earlier. Xskelly managed to take a win off of Skirikyu or whatever his name is in LC, which does help that case. So the Hadrians, moving on to the next situation, if they tie and the Bolts lose or tie, they automatically make it in. That will put them on 7 points. None of the teams down here, the Snoms, Alakazams, and Goodras, they can't catch the Hadrians anymore. So if they tie and the Bolts lose or tie, then they're in. If they tie and the Bolts win by a differential of +4 or better, and this is a situation where the Roughlets basically lose to the Bolts in a the Roughlets lose to the Bolts like 6-2 basically. And then in this case, the Hadrians and the Bolts would make it through, and the Roughlets would be 5th seed. Or better. So it could actually be 8-0, and that would also do good enough for them. If they lose by a differential of -6 or better, and the Bolts lose, and the Snoms, Alakazams don't pass them in differential. So what this means is there's a few situations where the Snoms and the Alakazams and the Goodras can all pass them, all pass the Hadrians in the situation that they lose. Actually, I believe this is not true. Basically, if they lose by a big margin, then they could actually get passed by either the Snoms or the Alakazams or the Goodras can all pass them if they lose by a large differential. So, for example, if they lose 7-1 against the Goodras and the Bolts lose and the Goodras are actually in, as long as like if the Snoms and Alakazams lose. If they lose 7-1 and the Alakazams also go 8-0, then and the Bolts lose, then the Alakazams can, or actually I believe that they don't even need that many, but just an example, right? So if the Alakazams do go 8-0, then yeah, that is the situation that this situation is, or that is the situation that this line is describing. Basically saying that if they lose by a large differential, they could still make it as long as the Goodras, Snoms, and Alakazams don't pass them. I believe this is actually the wrong number, but that's beside the issue. So tiebreaker, they can tiebreak against the Roughlets if they tie and the Roughlets lose. This is the same tiebreaker situation described earlier. It's very unlikely though. Most likely what will happen is one of these top situations. Most likely one of these top 2 or top 3 situations. But this is the dream situation for one of the lower ranked teams, which I'll go through a little bit later. So Bolts, they make it to playoffs if they make it if they win by a differential of 2 or greater, and what that means is just a 5-3 win, which is quote unquote a standard win. But they shouldn't settle for a dead game at 4-3. That's basically trolling. But yeah, if they make it on 5-3, or if they win by a differential of 1 and the Hadrians lose or tie, or if they tie and the Hadrians lose and the Snoms don't get a differential of 7 or greater. So what a differential of 7 or greater means is 7-0 or 8-0, 8-0, and the Snoms would have to win by this much. I believe this is not even possible anymore because the Snoms have already lost a game. But so in that case, it would be if they lose, if they tie and the Hadrians lose, then they will be in a spot where they actually get in. So I can just delete that real quick because the Snoms have already lost a game. So tiebreaker with the Roughlets if they win by a differential of 1 and the Hadrians win. And once again, I'm going to talk about it again, but like the differential of 1 is like very unlikely of happening. So don't worry too much about it. But the Bolts also can finish between 2nd and 8th. The second scenario would be basically they beat the Roughlets by a differential of 2 or greater, and the Hadrians also don't win that week. If they just tie, then the Bolts will make that 2nd seed. Okay, so the Snoms, they can make it in a very specific scenario. So they need to make it if the Hadrians and the Bolts lose. So all of these bottom teams will require the Hadrians and the Bolts to lose. And they can only make it to the 4th seed, and which is basically Roughlets, Swamperts, then Snorlaxes, then Roughlets, and then the 4th team. So that's the only situation that the Snoms, Alakazams, or Goodras can make it in. So they will have to make it so that the Hadrians and the Bolts lose, and they win by a differential of greater than 7 compared to the Hadrians. So for example, if the Hadrians lose 3-5 and the Snoms win 6-1, that would be a differential of 7 or greater. So if the Snoms win 7-1 and the Hadrians lose 3-5. Or the Hadrians lose and the Bolts tie and they get a differential of 8. So this is already not possible because one of the Snoms already lost. So we can just delete that situation. So tiebreaker against the Hadrians if they win by a differential of 6 compared to the Hadrians. So for example, 3-5 for the Hadrians and the Snoms win 6-2. So that's 2 differential, -2 for the Hadrians and then +4 for the Snoms. So total differential of 6. And the Hadrians and the Bolts lose. And then, or they tiebreaker against the Bolts if the Hadrians lose and the Bolts tie and they get a differential of 7. So this is already not possible once again. So we can just delete that. But now we're looking at a less likely playoff scenario, but still possible, where they basically need to win by a lot more than the Hadrians. And it's still possible. I would say that, like, for example, if the Hadrians lose 3-5, which is like a relatively likely scenario, then the Snoms could even win 6-2 and get a tiebreaker game or series. And that's actually like something that I would actually realistically kind of aim for as the Snoms, because you are still in a playoff position. You still are in a spot that you could potentially make it to the playoffs if you just pull together a really good week and Hadrians falter a little bit. This is a lot more reasonable to like imagine than some of the lower ranked teams. So for the Alakazams, this one is also pretty hard to imagine, but they could do it. Make it if the Hadrians and the Bolts lose. So like I said before, the Hadrians and the Bolts lose, and they win by a differential of 9 or greater compared to the Hadrians. So this would require you to go basically like if the Hadrians lose like 5-3, then you need to make up the other 7 differential. So you need to go either 7-0 or 8-0. It makes it a lot easier if the Hadrians lose like 2-6. So that would be 4 differential. So the other 5 you can make potentially like 6-1, or you could do 6-1 or 7-1. Tiebreaker against the Hadrians if both the Hadrians and the Bolts lose and they win by a differential of 8 compared to the Hadrians. So a differential of the 8 is kind of similar to what the Snom situation is, but the Snoms is only requires 6 versus the 8 of the compared to the 8 of the Alakazams. So you can see here that the differential here between -7 and -5 is the reason behind that. So if the Hadrians end up losing, Hadrians and Bolts end up losing, and then the Alakazams could potentially creep it up. If the say Hadrians lose 3-5 and the Alakazams win 7-1, then they could potentially creep in there. But they are playing against us, so we'll see how it goes. I would love to see the Alakazams make it to playoffs, but I'm not gonna like tell my players to throw my games or whatever. That's like really stupid. We still won't care a little bit about showing good form before playoffs, but it would be a good story. Also, other stuff has to happen. The Bolts have to lose, but we'll see how all of that plays out. I would say that it's too early to give up hope, but I wouldn't say that by the time the weekend rolls around that all the teams are still in the playoff race. The Goodras are actually the ones that have the simplest scenario. They can only make it through if they win by a differential of 6 or greater, and the Bolts lose. So, wait. Actually, this is not the only conditional. So let me edit this real quick. So it's 6 or greater, and the Bolts lose, and the Snoms, Alakazams don't pass them in differential. Okay, so it's still possible that if they win by a differential of 6, and the Alakazams, for example, also win by a differential of like 4, then the Alakazams will make it in over them. And that's actually like a scenario that hurts the Goodras, but the Goodras are kind of the ones that control a lot of the power here because they are one of the lower seeded teams right now that actually are playing for that playoff spot against the Hadrians. The Hadrians being the critical team that I've talked about a lot throughout this video or the stream. But you'll be able to see that all of these teams could finish between 4 to 8 for these bottom three. The 4th and 5th place can finish between 2 and 8, and the Roughlets between 2 and 5, and then both the Swamperts and ourselves locked for playoffs. So we'll go through a little bit of the players. A few storylines heading into this week. So Trade being the only 5-0 player. There's actually no 6-0 players so far, so far. And Trade has been having a fantastic performance up until now. Fellyburn actually lost a game, so he's 5-2 now. Mikab also losing a game, 5-1. Z-Strat's putting up a great performance at 5-1 as well. Floss also 5-1. Excelsior at 4-0. Friso Ava sitting at 4-1, having a loss against who did he lose against? Blimax, that's right. Mac 3 also having a 4-1 record for the Alakazams, being a strong performer for them. And then a lot of, like you can see a lot of these strong performances up here, including Cheese here at 4-1. Dandaman still sitting at 3-0, having a strong season as well. So that's like about all there is here. And then we'll go through all of the matchups for this week. Oh, also, just a shout out, the Welsh Wall. You guys aren't locked for first place yet. You guys can still lose in a relatively common scenario, so don't get too hyped yet. But yeah. Okay, so Swamperts versus Snoms. I went through the situations, but Snoms definitely need to win if they want any sort of chance at a playoff seed. And they already are off to a bad start with the Maroon losing them mono, but they're going to have a relatively tough path ahead of them. Friso Ava versus Tempering. Friso is very favored here. Cheese, I think, is slightly better than Lugia Numer, and Ramo Lost has probably slightly better than TMM. I think NRTS is definitely favored in RU, as well as GW favored in NU. Plaz in LC, and Mishimono in doubles. So honestly, if they can put together all 6 of these wins, and the pivotal one would be basically Tempering. If Tempering can beat Friso Ava and they go 7-1 in the rest of the games, I wouldn't even say that they have a terrible shot at making playoffs. So I would say that the Snoms are probably in perhaps a better spot than most people would expect, sitting at only 4 points. I think that their season, or so far this season, they just haven't been able to show up, especially their best players who everyone knows is good, like Mishimono, like Plaz, has just not had the strongest season due to various reasons, whether that be motivation issues or whatever it is. And I can kind of understand because of a lot of the DLC coming out, a lot of other tours happening, etc. So if they do put together this one good week, though, with all their good players, then they could potentially look into the playoff picture. For the Hadrians versus the Goodras are probably the team that I'm the least high on. They have a lot of whatever players, and they're all trending downwards. And so this looks like a very tough week for them, even though it's very important. I think keeping it icy should be favored against Star Real, although this one is very close. I think Ewin versus Little Spooks is also very favored to Ewin. GXC, I think, is heavily favored in UU. I think SMB is favored in RU. I don't know about either of these players in NU, but I'll probably say Sice is a little bit more favored. I'm not too high on Saba as a player. And then Xkelly already picked up his win. And then Z-Strats is heavily favored in doubles. And I think the Deckham versus Dugza matchup should be very close. I think either player could take that one, but I would slightly favor Dugza here, who's been having a pretty strong performance. So with that, I think that if the Goodras want any chance of putting together a playoff run, then they definitely need a lot of stepping up to do. And whether that's be luck or matchup or players performing much better than they currently have, they definitely need a lot of help that they haven't shown the ability to do yet. And both the Snoms and the Alakazams are also rooting for them because their playoff line also their playoff lives also hinge on the Goodras having a strong performance. The Bolts versus the Roughlets is going to be a very, very crucial matchup for playoffs. I think both the Hadrians versus Goodras and the Bolts versus Roughlets have the most implications on playoffs. So Trade versus Blimax, I think, is favored towards Trade, who has had a really strong performance all season. Prodhan should be favored here in OU versus APW. I think Snowfall versus Oras Mega is very close, but I'll favor Snowfall slightly. And I'll favor PCD over Arsenine, who's been having a very poor performance this BLT. I think Skipcan has shown really strong performances up until now, and I think he's much better in NU. And then Mikav should be much better in LC as well. I think Shadow Monster is very clearly favored in doubles, and then Floss in mono. So I would say that the Roughlets are in a good spot. If they have a strong performance, then they will make playoffs. Just a tie is good enough for them. Even some situations they lose, they're still fine. The Bolts, though, definitely need to put together a really strong week this week. And they've been outperforming expectations this entire season. So if they continue their strong performances, they definitely could be in that conversation for being like a playoff team. So finally, the Alakazams versus us. I think that we aren't playing our strongest lineups, but the Alakazams definitely have a chance. Ham should be favored against Reginald, and same with Twixtree, who are both great OU players. Tectonic Destroyer versus Prince of Altaka should be pretty interesting. Mac 3 already put together a win versus Fellyburn, and then Ziri should be favored in NU as he already has bounced back. Earthgurgle versus Tendi's Papa Come to Papa will be interesting, and then same with Havens versus Raph in doubles. Kather versus Mackey's Fox should also be relatively interesting. If the Alakazams can put together a good week, they could save their season, but because there's so many other things that are conspiring against them, likely it won't matter. I'll go through my top 5 highlights very quickly here at the end. And I'm going to be picking ones that have like very strong playoff implications because I think some of the other ones will not matter as much. So I think the ones that matter a lot will be Abyssal Ruins versus Star Real, who both have had really pretty strong seasons each, having shown good and bad things on both sides. I think the other one to look out for in this Goodras versus Hadrians matchup is definitely Sensei Axew versus SMB. Although Sensei Axew has been touted as one of the better RU players now, SMB is still really strong, has very powerful fundamentals, and has shown the ability to play some of these lower tiers in prior weeks. In the Bolts versus Roughlets matchup, I would mostly look at Trade versus Blimax because Trade has been phenomenal so far. While Blimax has shown good performances, he's also shown a lot of bad performances, so we'll have to see how he shows up that day. And I think Snowfall versus Oras Mega will also be very interesting. Both, although maybe perhaps not the highest UU match or highest quality UU match, it does have a lot of implications and it's very close. And the last one being PCD versus Arsenine, and this one will be mostly on Arsenine to see if he can return to his prior form. Otherwise, PCT can redeem an otherwise like mediocre season for himself here as well. So we'll see how all of the matches end up going down. I'm very excited for playoffs. Oh my god, I'm talking really fast because I wanted to try to get through all of this material within a relatively reasonable time frame. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope everything that I said makes some sense to you. And I look forward to playoffs next week. We'll see if there's tiebreakers or not. Honestly, given the scenarios, it's actually not super likely that we get any tiebreakers, but I am interested to see which teams do make it out, and I wish the best of luck to all of the teams that are involved. And that said, thank you guys for watching. If you are watching on Twitch, leave a follow. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a like and subscribe. And I'll see you guys next week for round 1 of the playoffs for BLT. And yeah.